Hi, I'm Jane McCallion.
And I'm Adam Shepherd.
Welcome to the ITPro Podcast, your weekly guide to the most important topics in the IT industry.
So, Jane, happy Equal Pay Day. Today is officially the day that you stop being paid for the year based on the gender pay gap.
This just feels very alarming.
I know what you mean. It comes around faster and faster every year, doesn't it?
The John Lewis ad for Equal Pay Day, where the ladies don't get paid anymore. It's out. It's just sweet. No, I think actually it's quite good. It puts it in real kind of perspective, the problem with the gender pay gap across all industries. Equal pay, as well as other topics around diversity and equality, are something that we will be coming to later on when we are talking about how upskilling and cross-skilling can be the answer to your skills gap, with Dominic Harvey from CW Jobs later on in the show. But first of all, should we talk about this week's top news stories?
We shall. So the first thing to get to is the first election news, first story of many, presumably, and that is that Labour has been hit by a supposed cyber attack.
Yes. Now, cyber attack is a word that covers many sins, and it seems that at the beginning of the week, on Monday, Labour was hit by a DDoS attack, a distributed denial of service. I've seen this described online as cyber vandalism. That's not really fair. That's more like taking down somebody's website. It's kind of cyber vandalism. DDoS is a bit more like... It's almost like trying to ram raid somewhere, really. It's a very kind of blunt, brutal, try to put somebody out of business type way of flooding systems with just loads of traffic.
My go-to metaphor for this is if a DDoS is a hack, then ramming a shop window with a moped is a heist.
I mean, well, it can be the beginning of a heist. Why not? The heist is what comes afterwards. And, in fairness, DDoS are also frequently used to cover up other goings-on. So
the thing with DDoS, for me, is you can launch a DDoS attack with a credit card. You know, DDoS as a service is something that's been around for ages. This could be a cyber criminal with their own botnet, or it could be a hacked-off right-wing activist with a credit card and an axe to grind.
Yeah, I mean... Just because something is amateur rather than sophisticated, really, as it was originally described, doesn't mean it's not serious. This is still, at the end of the day, an attack on their infrastructure, and as I understand it, they use Cloudflare, which will have absorbed a lot of the network traffic. Otherwise, that would have been a problem. If they hadn't had something there, it would have been significantly more important than what has happened.
The big question for me is whether or not this is likely to be the start of a series of cyber attacks, election-focused cyber attacks.
Almost certainly, but we don't have very much time between now and the election, so all those cyber baddies out there better get their skates on if they want to do any damage before the election.
From that, we move on to the next big piece of news, which broke last night as we record this. So Mirantis has bought Docker, or we should say part of Docker.
Yes. So Mirantis is best known for being a Kubernetes house. Kubernetes and Docker, if you're not familiar with them, are cloud orchestration container platforms. For a long time, Docker was the big player. It was first out of the gate for 2014, 2015, 2016. It was all about Docker, and when Kubernetes came in wrong, I was like, Kuba who? Come back. Let me come back. But now Kubernetes is the big player and Docker less so. So, yeah, what's going to happen to Docker after this? Because Docker Enterprise is sort of its big business play, and if it's being swallowed up by Mirantis, which is going to run it alongside their Kubernetes offerings, is what remains of it going to remain, or is this kind of the beginning of the end?
Firstly, it depends whether you're talking about Docker the company or Docker the technology. And I think, honestly, for Docker the technology, this is the best thing that could have happened to it. Docker the company, really hasn't been meeting much success with it. Whereas maybe Mirantis has got a bit more clout to actually beef up adoption in the enterprise space. Docker, the company, I think they're still going to focus on Docker Hub and the Docker registry, which are vital parts of the Docker ecosystem, and I don't think they're going away anytime soon. But I think we may well end up seeing Docker, the company, what remains of it, being acquired by somebody like Red Hat or another player in that kind of open source infrastructure space.
Okay, and speaking of other late breaking news, which we seem to be a fan of now on the ITPro podcast, there's a new MacBook from Apple. And then this morning, the office was wild with news of the new Motorola Razr.
I am very, very excited by one of these announcements. Let's start with the new MacBook Pro. It's a 16-inch model, replacing the 15-inch MacBook Pro that was the previous top-end model. Starts at $2,300, which is not actually a ridiculous price for a MacBook Pro. It's got a six-core i9 processor. I think 16 gig of RAM is standard. That's a beefy spec. People have been bandying around the $6,000 price for the top-end configuration, but a good chunk of that is the 8 terabyte SSD that the top-end configuration has. You take that out, the price comes down by like $3,000. That's what we've always seen on Apple devices. Speaking of MacBooks, Apple's sales chief has gone on record saying that children won't do well in a classroom education environment if they're using Chromebooks, presumably, as opposed to MacBooks. This feels like an example of privilege because, a lot of schools, particularly in the UK, they can barely afford computers, let alone a suite of MacBooks for the classroom. And saying that, Chromebooks just aren't going to provide a good educational experience, it feels a bit rich, pardon the pun, given that the latest MacBook starts in excess of $2,000.
I feel a bit Christine Keeler here. It's a bit like, he would say that, wouldn't he?
Well, quite.
Yeah, of course he's going to say that kind of the main competitor in the school marketplace, which we need to actually to understand this statement, we need to look at the US school system where it is, the battle is done between Mac and Chromebooks.
But the thing I'm most excited about is the Motorola Razr.
Is it?
Yes, absolutely, yes. I may slightly be showing my age here, but or lack thereof, as the case may be. But the original Motorola Razr V3 was the absolute bomb when I was at school. Everybody had one. That was, it was a real kind of status symbol. It was the first mainstream mobile for my generation. Like that was the one that everyone had.
Oh, right.
Before that, you'd get the odd Nokia 3310 or a couple of the Sony Walkman phones. But when the Razr V3 came out, everyone had one of those.
See, everyone had a Nokia 3310 when I was the age that you are describing now. But I think that says more about the hosts than it does the technology. The new one, is it? Would you buy it?
Kinda, yeah. It's $1,500. No UK pricing available as yet,
and that'll be ex-tax as well.
Yeah. So yeah, you're looking at $1,000+. It's a foldable phone, but it's a clamshell fold as opposed to the book fold style hinge employed by the likes of the Galaxy Fold and the Surface Duo. We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, we will be talking about the role that upskilling and cross-skilling can play in reducing the diversity problem in the tech space. See you after the break.
Hello, I'm Ollie Mann, and every Friday on The Week Unwrapped, we cover the stories you might have missed with journalists from theweek.co.uk. It's all the big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. That's The Week Unwrapped with me, Ollie Mann, available now for free from all good podcast apps.
Welcome back, and we are now joined by Dominic Harvey, Director at CW Jobs. Diversity, it's a big topic. It's something that comes up all the time. with regard to the tech space. Quite often we end up talking about education with regards to the science technology, curriculum, that kind of thing. That presents a bit of a pipeline problem. While we're waiting for everybody to be trained up, we've still got an existing problem with a lack of diversity, whether that is male, female, whether it is transgender or cisgender or heterosexual, homosexual, race, wherever you want to cut these lines. What are the ways that we can sort of address that more immediately with the people who we have in place already?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head that it's going to take a long time for that pipeline of tech talent to come through from late primary school, secondary school. We're probably early 2030s before we're seeing that actually in the workplace. So I think that we've got to take action as businesses in the UK to start plugging that gap now. And one of the options on that is to reskill, cross-skill, retrain the current workforce we have. And that is an excellent mechanism for plugging that gap. And what you can actually do is size the talent pool and make the percentages of that talent pool. You can choose that from within your current workforce.
What's the best way then for people to identify strategies for upskilling or cross-skilling within their business?
I think obviously there's got to be a desire within the members that you choose to understand tech, but I also think that you can present that to your workforce and advertise the fact that these are the opportunities we are offering you, and this is what it will mean to your career down the line. Undoubtedly, there are huge benefits to having a tech skill. Research we did recently said that 2/3 of business leaders would consider a tech skill higher than maths or science, which I found quite shocking, that it's got to those levels. But if you think about it, to interact in the modern workplace, and in fact outside of the modern workplace, you need to understand tech. It's an English skill, it's a language skill almost, to interact with that environment. So I think there's got to be the desire, and then obviously the people within your tech team will have some very strong opinions, I'd imagine, on the kind of qualities that a would-be developer, a would-be data analyst, a would-be business analyst requires, winding that back to what are the raw components we need within that.
I think you've raised a really interesting point with the idea that it's an English skill, kind of those kind of development and tech skills. One of the things that we hear repeatedly on this topic is that cross-skilling can help bring those kind of English skills, humanities skills, art skills, problem-solving skills, creative thinking into the development sphere, like thereby making development teams and tech teams stronger, because a lot of people who come through traditional engineering routes and software development routes to higher education and whatnot often don't necessarily have as firm a grounding in those areas. Would you say that cross-skilling can be an effective way to bolster the capabilities of your tech team in areas outside of just what people might think of as traditional tech?
100%. If you look at bringing somebody on, say, from your finance department that's showing real aptitude in getting involved in the tech department, they will know those financial processes, the ins and outs of that department much better than a developer. Or there's something quite strange happening. And they can bring inside knowledge and maybe shortcuts to success, saving time and money effectively. And I think the whole creativity piece is really important. If you look at sheer numbers, we are going to be crushed by India and China. One of the things we have to our advantage still is that creative piece. And if we can be ahead of the game within that and cross-fertilising ideas from bringing people in from different departments, I think that could be a real next step strength.
It might be helpful actually at this point to say, what is the difference between cross-skilling and upskilling? Is there a difference between the two?
I think if there's an aptitude for, already an aptitude for tech, then you can simply buy into that and amplify it within a team member. I think of more of that as cross-skilling. Retraining would be taking somebody who shows a real aptitude, and we've done it within the Total Jobs group, which CW Jobs is part of, and taken salespeople and trained them to be really efficient business analysts, and it's worked very, very effectively. We've got probably 3 or 4 really good examples of people that come out of the sales team, but then when they work on projects which involve the sales team, have a real understanding of what the sales guys want, and that's a real strength.
Were they identified as people who would be good targets for retraining, or had they raised it with their managers? How does this normally go?
I think there was a frustration within our development team of where to get business analysts. They're hugely in demand, much like almost every area of tech specialism. And they were, I suppose, tired of bringing people on, still taking, even though they were efficient business analysts, but still taking 3 or 4 months to train them in the culture of the business, the way the business worked. And they flipped that on the head and said, well, why don't we advertise for junior business analysts within our own team and ask them if they want to come on? So that 3 or 4 month training lag was still there, but it was more on the technical and business analysis side than it was on learning the culture, because that was already embedded.
Yeah. Our premise, obviously, this conversation is that upskilling and cross-skilling are a way to address diversity issues. The majority of people working in tech now are men, the majority of them are white. Is cross-skilling and upskilling an answer to kind of diversifying that demographic? And we don't want to diversify just for the sake of diversity either. So
yeah, it should be pointed out at this juncture that diversity, particularly when it comes to tech teams, is not just a corporate social responsibility box ticking exercise. It does have genuine benefits for quality of product and quality of code. Development teams that have a more diverse selection of members produce better, more stable code in shorter time spans than teams that don't.
And I think there's an interesting example of AI being applied to a recruitment process. And what they found was, over the course of a year, is that this AI process was favouring men, because it was based on previous experience, and that experience was, well, you know what, 25 to 30-year-old men are really good at this job, my AI is telling me, and that means we must then go after those people. That's what the AI was essentially doing. So it was actually prejudicing against women. And, obviously I'd hope that if a woman was more involved in that, they would have spotted that quite quickly.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up, because there was actually a study that was done a couple of years ago that showed that female developers who were contributing code on GitHub actually had a higher rate of acceptance for the code and approval than male developers did, but only if they couldn't be identified as women. If they could be identified as women, that approval rate dipped, which, I mean, is a fairly strong indicator of a general level of bias within the kind of development space that goes towards your point about kind of that entrenched attitude.
Yeah, and it's interesting, we joined a charter, #TechSheCan, which tries to redress the gender imbalance. And some of the early meetings that they had, anecdotally, it was said that in primary school that the girls actually were the better problem solvers. But something happened towards the end of primary school, the beginning of secondary school, that meant that they were disenchanted with tech, disenchanted with these using these really good problem solving abilities. So I think if you can dig out the root cause of that, we can hopefully continue that through the actual schooling process and into university and then into the workplace.
But the problem, I mean, this gets back to why upskilling can be so powerful for addressing diversity, because it is those kind of systemic base level issues in the education and in society generally that mean that our pipelines into the tech sector aren't bringing the level of diversity that we need. So effectively, we need to bring in candidates and staff from areas outside of those existing pipelines. And I think that's where upskilling and cross-skilling can play a huge role, because those biases and those gender imbalances aren't there to the same degree in areas like, for example, project management, which can provide a really rich field for recruiting into your tech environment from within your business.
I think it's also really important, this isn't just suddenly stack your development team with women, like some kind of modernised 1950s typing pool or something like that. You have to have women as decision makers right through the hierarchy. And that's useful for a few reasons, but one is so there is something that people can aspire to be, that the women can aspire to be, for example, the females in the company. But also you don't get this feeling of when someone's fast-tracked to management to tick a box because we've got a female manager, they then look above them and on the board it's the same old white males, of a certain age, who are, as it was put to me the other day by somebody exactly in that position, who are living longer, living healthier, and having to retire later. Effectively, they have been fast-tracked to a bus stop they have to wait at even longer.
Yeah, it's one of the downsides of general improving health.
I mean, I will say, I spoke to Jane Silber, who at the time was the CEO of Canonical. She's still on their board, during our first Women in Tech Month about 3 years ago now. And one of the problems that she raised, and other people I have spoken to as well, particularly women, is the problem of retention. So you get all these women, you get them to learn, get them into university, they graduate, they go into jobs, and within a year they're gone. Typically because of the kind of prejudices and pressures that they face in the workplace that their male colleagues do not. And so I suppose potentially then upskilling and cross-skilling, you've kind of overcome that prejudice barrier to an extent already, because the person has already made their way into the business. And it's so easy to fall into the trope of women in tech because it has been the big push. But there are many, many other areas that we need to think about as well, whether that, like I say, it doesn't matter whether it's gender or race. Technology is such an important part of our lives, as you say, that the people who are behind making it really should reflect the people who will be using it at the end of the day. I mean, Adam, because we've worked together for many years now, how much time I spend moaning about the size of phones and the size and weight of technology, because it is, if you're a man, it's kind of fine. But if you're a woman, quite often, most phones are big in the hand. A friend of mine has the latest flagship Apple phones, but she's had to get one of those weird little things on the back to hold it because it is heavy and it is big. You and I, we have standard vision, we don't have any hearing impairments, we don't have any mobility impairments. There are lots of things that we wouldn't see or experience that those people who fit into any of those other categories would be able to bring to the table. And I think that when we are talking about anything, whether this is women in tech, whether it is, kind of cross-skilling, upskilling, all ways to kind of bring about diversity, we have to think broadly about what that means.
So one of the key things for me is we've talked a lot about, if you like, the theory of upskilling and why it is so important. But how can companies actually put it into practice? Because it's one thing saying that we really value upskilling as a company and we really want to cross-skill as many of our employees as we can. What are the first steps towards actually making that a reality within your business?
Well, here's quite a straightforward way of doing it. I was speaking to somebody from the BBC recruitment department, and they said they had a policy that invited mothers returning to work that were interested in maybe moving into tech to apply for 24 roles.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They had 15,000 applicants. From what I remember from the conversation, they had 15,000 applicants.
Wow. But
that is 24 people, females, that they're bringing into their tech department. And that will maybe not redress the balance immediately, and yes, people will move on and things like that, but that's a pretty hard and fast way of doing it. Now, not everybody's the BBC. If you're a small software house and it's about margins and about the size of your order book, you might not be able to invest to that level. But if you do have companies doing that, Sky's also a really good example, taking school leavers rather than waiting until they come out of university, which I thought was quite progressive as well. Being bold enough to say, what's your maths like? How's your science? Are you good at English? Obviously, the required intelligence to be able to teach you these tech skills. And from what I've heard, that's going well, and they're beginning to come off that conveyor belt and into actual projects, etc.
Yeah, and I think the BBC example is incredibly powerful. Amazon earlier this year announced that it was launching a return to work scheme for women that had been out of work for 2 or more years to bring them into kind of tech roles within their organisation. And according to a Booking.com report from March, almost 2/3 of women thought that taking a career break was detrimental to career progression. So supporting women kind of coming back from career breaks like childbirth is so important, I think.
No, it's not a break. Yeah, no, I agree, because it's, it is very easy to, even if you're not actually being left behind, it's easy to feel that you have been left behind somehow. And I think, it's important to have that kind of support. And if it can be in an area, especially seeing as how a lot of areas typically dominated by women are increasingly being automated, actually, if you can kind of help women and people from other ethnic groups, areas where there is a lot of automation going on and it is at their expense, hop that fence into the driving seat of the tech, then, which is always the premise. If that could be made reality through upskilling, I think that's great.
And there's a real dread of being out of the workplace, but it's particularly acute for maternity. But it's particularly acute in IT for obvious reasons, that things are the staggering pace of change. If you're out for 6 or 12 months, must feel like 2-3 years compared to about 20 years ago. Just because you don't know what you're necessarily coming back to. It's a tangible thing. People dread, are making really conscious decisions on, can I afford this time out, not just for my career, but my ability to be able to come back into the workplace. So retraining these people, these women, is absolutely vital. Or actually, the men, if they're taking paternity, which is becoming an acceptable norm now.
If we could wrap up with one kind of piece of advice for companies who are looking to get better at upskilling their staff, what would your kind of ideal starting point be?
First of all, I joined Tech Talent Charter, and what they do is concentrate on diversity in the workplace. It's not just purely focused on women. And all they ask for is anonymous data to look at the diversity of yourself in the workplace, and then they give you that report back. You can then measure yourself against the UK norms, and then know if you're doing a brilliant job. And maybe you can come to one of their sessions and describe what you're doing. Maybe you're way behind. Maybe you're bang average. But what is the guidance that they can give you? And I think that's really important for us to get a real grip on what is actually happening out there. Thereafter, I think it's involving women within the recruitment process at all levels. So mentoring them once they've got through the interview, but actually having a woman in the interview to show that this is part of our culture. We're not worried about women coming into our tech department or anything like that, and breaking down those barriers.
Well, that's all we have time for this week. Thank you once again, Dom, for coming to join us. You can find links to all of the topics we've spoken about today in the show notes, and even more on our website, itpro.co.uk. You can also follow us on Twitter @ITPro, as well as on Facebook and LinkedIn. Don't forget to subscribe to the ITPro Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever else you find podcasts. We'll be back next week with more news and analysis from the world of IT. Until then, goodbye.